Order. Well, welcome everyone to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee. And this is the latest evidence session in our review into governing the marine environment. The first panel is concerned with fishing, energy and nature. We're joined today by Mr. Mike Cohen, Mr. Jacques Villemot and Mr. Barry Sykes. Thank you very much. Sorry, Benj Sykes. So I couldn't quite read it from there. Benj Sykes. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Can I ask you, starting with you, Mr. Cohen, to introduce yourselves, your role and your organisation, please?
So, thank you. I'm Mike Cohen. I'm the Chief Executive of the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations. So we are an umbrella body, a membership organisation made up of regional fishermen's associations and fish producers organisations. Mostly in England and Wales, a few members in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Like the National Fleet, most of our members are smaller inshore vessels, but we also have offshore and distant waters boats too, so the whole gamut.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. Villemot.
Hello, my name is Jacques Villemot, and I'm the Marine Rewilding Lead for Rewilding Britain.
Excellent, thank you. And Benj?
Good afternoon, I'm Benj Sykes from Ørsted. We're a global renewable energy developer. I head up Ørsted's business in the UK. We're quite big. We've invested, I think, 16 billion in the UK, with another 16 to 18 billion coming up in clean infrastructure. And I have a particular focus on environmental matters in the UK and across Europe and actually globally within the company.
Thank you very much indeed. Starting with you, Mr. Cohen, and asking all of the panel, how effectively do you believe that current approaches to marine planning strike the right balance between nature restoration and preservation and the economic needs of the economy?
I think the situation has been improving over the last 2 or 3 years, certainly with more integrated decision making, by which I mean more of the people who are able to control what happens in the sea are starting to talk to one another. DEFRA, Marine Management Organisation, the Crown Estate. There's increasing coordination, but I still think we can go further. I would like to see a more strategic approach to what we do with our seas. We produce food. The nation produces food, we produce energy, we use it for recreation, we get building materials out of it, we bury nuclear, we do all sorts of things, and we do all of them separately. And I think it's time to have a more integrated conversation about what the nation needs and how it's going to get it from the sea. I think that's starting. I don't think it's quite happening yet.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Villemot. From your perspective, to what extent is the right balance being struck at the moment? Is it improving?
I think it's fair to say it's improving. However, we're not there yet. The UK is not currently on track to meeting its net zero targets. Not on track to meet its nature target either. Fell 11 out of 15 of the good environmental status indicators for the past. It's meant to be met in 2020. So we're not there yet. I completely agree with the fact that we need a more integrated approach. There is sort of a need to better take into consideration the various sort of use of our seas, but also front load the marine environment as part of that, to make sure that we take an ecosystem-based approach throughout every sort of planning decision. And there needs to be also a need for more prioritization at the minute. We know that we have those big targets to meet. We are sort of in an urgency to meet them, and there's something that's going to have to give at some point. So there needs to be a bit of a more integrated approach, but also one that prioritizes better for us to be able to meet those targets.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mr. Sykes.
Yes, thank you. I would echo what my two colleagues here have said. I think we have made great progress with more to do. Offshore wind is, as I'm sure the committee will know, is being taken forward as the backbone of our clean electricity system. That means a rapidly accelerating build-out of energy infrastructure offshore. But there are many other activities that are also important to Britain's economic and social well-being, as Mike mentioned earlier. I think we are seeing progress. For example, the Crown Estate is now developing a whole of seabed plan. That's taking into account multiple stakeholders, multiple sea users. We've also got the National Electricity System Operator, NESO, developing a strategic spatial energy plan. And I'm pleased to say that they are listening about the need to integrate environmental as well as human use aspects into that plan. So we're definitely pointing in the right direction. The pace at which we're making these changes is a challenge, but I think that pace is needed for both the climate crisis and the nature crisis that we face.
Yeah, and what practices would you like to see adopted to better achieve that balance and integration?
Very good question. I think a lot of where we need to go now is more integration, not just coordination, but integration across government departments. I work closely with DEFRA, with DESNES, with the Ministry of Defence and others about coexistence in the sea. Also, as a business, we work very closely with many of Mike's members around fishing. So I think we know that the government departments are working on this, but as someone once said, there's no such thing as government, just government departments, and we need to see that integration, which actually we have seen strengthen over the last 12 months. I think that can go a lot further so that we approach these as a single set of challenges rather than departmental ones, and also their arm's length bodies. A lot of work to do there as well.
Yeah. Mr. Cohen, from your perspective, what practices would you like to see adopted to better achieve that balance?
A lot of what Benj just said there, I think that's well put. I think greater coordination between departments is really, really necessary. I think, look, we've had announcements on, let's take it offshore energy. The Crown Estate has announced that it wants, I think, 125 gigawatts of offshore wind in English waters. Crown Estate Scotland wants 42 gigawatts in their waters. We've got 30 gigawatts of nuclear, I think, proposed on land, and more solar on land. And altogether, so many different organisations, different bodies have their own plans for something, which will affect the sea to a greater or lesser extent. But all those plans added up together are far more energy than the UK uses, and far more than any projection. So we really need to get beyond the stage of aspirations and proposals and have some more integrated strategic thinking, bringing in. But NESO is starting to have an impact, and I think I haven't yet got a sense of how they're going to work myself, but I think they've got the potential to be very useful in that space, in giving some certainty to, or clarity to, that discussion around the mix of energy uses. Then that needs to feed into how we're using the sea. So we need consultation at all levels, as with communities, businesses, but it needs to feed into a strategic process. Ultimately, decisions are going to have to be taken about how the sea is used. I'm always, my job is to advocate for the food production sector at sea. I know there are other uses to which the sea can be put that the nation may need. Somebody will have to take a decision. Which one will win? They can't. Everybody can't have everything. Those hard decisions will have to be taken probably in this building. Yes. I'd like you to have the fullest possible information about all the different uses we can put to it, and then for you to prioritise and take a really kind of level-headed and cold decision about it, really.
I mean, in terms of that planning and sort of strategic approach, we've had the marine plan came out of legislation in, I think, 2009. Mm-hmm. Then the regional marine plans being discussed in 2011. With 13 years on from that, we're saying all we need is an integrated plan. What's your sense as to why we're still having basically the same conversations we were having 13 years ago?
Totally agree with that. And we're renewing one of the marine plans now, and there'll be more, because we are still doing this siloed. The point that Benj made about different departments doing their own things. We are treating these as separate issues, and they're not. They're about the use of the marine space. It's not an energy issue or a food production issue or a conservation issue, because they all lay claim to the same area, and so does transport and defence and leisure. They're all legitimate users of the sea, but we need that whole of government approach, never mind whole of seabed, but let's have a whole of government approach to deciding what we do with it all. Yeah. Have that as a very open and public conversation with us, and take the hard choices. I think maybe that we still get this because the choices that are going to be made are going to be quite difficult. You're going to tell somebody they can't have what they want. You're going to tell somebody perhaps that the thing they've done for a long time they can't do anymore. And you're going to have to own those decisions. Yeah. And that's a hard thing to do. So I think maybe we've just pushed that along for the next guy to deal with.
Mr. Villemot, we've heard in previous evidence sessions that the UK government has designated large numbers of marine protected areas, but has been less effective at ensuring that these areas are genuinely protected after they've been designated. What what do you see as the main reasons why we have sort of met the 30 by 30 in terms of the amount of designated areas, but actually in terms of the amount of those areas that are genuinely protected, we're failing?
I think, there's an element that will come down to what people around me have been saying already today. I think there's sort of a need to be making those decisions and to sort of prioritize sort of what area are being used for what purposes, and that includes nature conservation as well as part of that. The marine protected area, properly protected, is going to have some restriction on activities that need to take place within part of it, and potentially as well to developments that take place within their borders, the boundaries. So there needs to be better integrated as part of the marine spatial planning system. That's for sure, and there needs to be as well a marine spatial planning system that is strong and sort of has that prioritization level integrated as part of it to be able to organize a little bit development activities at seas and ensure that the marine protected areas are truly protected. There's going to be a need to better restrict activities that take place within them. We also know that there is projects in place, processes in place to better restrict activities such as bottom trawling, for example. That's been going on for a long time, but it has been sort of a bit consistently delayed. That needs to be accelerated. I'm not the reasons of why is harder for me to decide, because this is often conversations that are happening behind closed doors, but it seems a bit of a no-brainer from my point of view that there is some of particularly destructive activities that need to be restricted within those protected sites.
Yeah. Mr. Cohen, to what extent does the designation of a marine protected area influence the way that a local fishing fleet would operate?
I think it's not so much the designation as the management. So marine protected areas are designated for a wide variety of reasons, many of which really don't intersect with fishing at all. Our largest MPAs off the east coast of the UK are to do with harbour porpoise and seabirds, and they don't really have a great deal of interaction with what we're doing in those areas because we're concerned with the seabed. In other areas, there may be more. I think what we're really keen to see is that we'd like to see some certainty about the management in MPAs. We'd like to know what the rules are going to be. That matters, and it matters to us that they are based on evidence of benefit, not just if we just ban things in areas on maps, we won't actually achieve conservation. I have a huge vested interest in conservation working, because if we don't have healthy seas, I can't pay the mortgage because we catch fish. We need healthy seas. We would just like to see the management measures that are brought about tallying up with the evidence for what measures will actually help to protect the environment in a given place. If that means that has an impact on fishing, then that's something we deal with at the time. But in most cases, it doesn't. Most of our activities don't have any negative conservation impacts and can coexist quite happily. Fishing's gone on for a very, very long time. Commercial fishing is well over 1,000 years old as an industry. We're still doing it in places we've been doing it in for generations.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of talk in this place about bottom trawling. Are there particular aspects of your membership that are more difficult to defend in environmental terms? And does that pose you problems trying to hold the whole thing together?
Difficult to defend only in that it's quite nuanced and it's quite rare that you get the opportunity to tell the whole story. Most bottom trawling activity doesn't do to the seabed what most people think. Trawls are designed to skim over the seabed. We're not trying to catch sand, we're trying to catch fish. If you dig into the seabed, you slow down, you use fuel, it costs money. So trawl gear is designed to skim the seabed as lightly as possible, not dig into it. Some kinds of dredges do dig into the seabed as much as 3 or 4 centimetres. But this is usually used over sandy ground because they're fishing for scallops, and they get those from sandy grounds that regenerate their scallop crop every year. That's the way a scallop fishery works. It's like ploughing a field and then coming back next year. Those trawls, absolutely, they change the seabed they pass over, and so does the weather, and so do the tides. A single winter storm will do more than every single trawler in the country could do to the seabed. The fact that that bottom trawling in those places has been happening, it's not random. Farmers plough fields and change the environment far more than we do when we fish. But they don't plough at random. They don't just set off in a tractor and hope somewhere they'll come across some wheat. They go where they know the crop is and they harvest it. So trawlers go to where they know, year after year, in some cases decade after decade, they will catch something and make a living. So the argument that they're in some way changing and devastating the environment doesn't fully hold water to me. They aren't roving wildly across the seabed. They're going to places where, consistently, there's a healthy crop of, be it scallops, be it flatfish, and they're still there. after generations in the same place.
Mr. Villemot, would you have a benigner view about bottom trawling?
So just to come back on the multi-use things, I mean, I don't disagree with Mike around the fact that I think there is potentially, you can envisage having absolute fisheries taking place within marine protected areas. I'm not talking about banning all sorts of fisheries from all protection. I think there's some sites that will need some specific protection, some others where absolutely multi-use is going to be critical. And I think as part of the planning system, that's some things that needs to be considered. Around bottom trawling, I mean, I think it depends on the area, and I think there are some areas that are designated for protection of the benthic environment, the benthic environment being the seabed, and these areas, of course, will protect some more fragile ecosystems for which on a case-by-case basis, but for marine protection, bottom trawling and sort of destructive fishing will not be compatible. But I completely agree with taking the decision on a science-based method, and I think that always needs to come down to evidence.
Thank you very much. Cameron Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. You touched earlier on the need for joined-up strategic thinking. Shipwrecks make for some of the world's most impressive dive sites, particularly because in the years following the sinking, marine life moves in, using it as an artificial reef. So to what extent can we join up marine renewables with marine restoration initiatives in terms of the technology?
So it's a big question how the offshore wind build-out can also play its role in recovery of nature. If I just touch on very briefly, technically, around the base of turbines, we will often put down scour protection to stop the base of the turbine getting eroded by sea currents. Those become reefs. We've got lots of evidence of that from around all of our European and actually our Asian wind farms as well. So that's one example where we see artificial reefs building up. Also, some sections of the export cables, where the power's brought to shore, where we've installed protection for those cables. Again, we see those reefs develop. At Ørsted, we're going a little bit further, well, quite a lot further actually. We've set an ambition that all of the projects that we commission from 2030 will have a net positive biodiversity impact. So we're now designing into our wind farms positive biodiversity outcomes above the top of the mitigation hierarchy. And we're running pilot programs around the world on the tools that we're going to use to deploy that into our project. So it's not a requirement anywhere, although marine net gain is going to potentially look a lot like it. But we can see how offshore wind, in particular, can be contributing to the solution of loss of environmental health in the oceans rather than adding to the problem. And we very much hope other developers will follow along behind us. We're also developing a way of measuring marine biodiversity so that we can actually demonstrate to everyone that we've achieved our ambition.
Thank you. Jacques, I saw you nodding along a little bit. What are your thoughts on that? What would you like to see?
No, I think absolutely. It's the reef effect is a real potential benefit that can come from putting some fixed structures within the marine environment. There's some things that needs to be considered. There is also sort of a potential risk around ecosystem shifts. So that's one thing that needs to be taken into consideration, and that means that again, it's going to come down to a case-by-case basis because there is potential risk associated with putting a reef in an area where you would have usually a sandbank. So that's something that needs to be considered. But completely agree with the fact that we need to sort of monitor those benefits, take that into consideration. That can potentially increase the biodiversity, increase the biomass. The risk is to not do it at the expense of the natural processes that are meant to take within this area.
Mike, did you want to follow up with anything?
Just to say that I think that highlights what a complicated issue it is, isn't it? If you put a reef in an area where there wasn't a reef, you've definitely changed that environment, and you may have changed the biological assemblage in there. So you're not restoring something; you're putting there something new. But if what you're putting in is new, is healthy, and contributes to a thriving ecosystem, maybe we just have to accept the fact that in the sea, as on the land, we are a thing that lives in its environment, changes it as it goes, as every living thing does. But overall environmental health is what matters, rather than being too fixed on what's happening in that particular place. A thriving, healthy reef where there didn't used to be one is still a thriving and healthy reef.
Thank you. In January, the government announced strategic compensation measures for offshore wind activities. What impact do you foresee the Marine Recovery Fund having on marine conservation efforts?
So I think the Marine Recovery Fund is a really important tool in the toolkit for offshore wind developers and for government. It was actually conceived within Ørsted, and then we worked and handed it over to DEFRA and DESNES to take forward into legislation, which finally is getting there. It has been a slow process. as Mike has said, and Jacques actually, we need to take a whole ecosystem approach. And what the Marine Recovery Fund does is it enables us to take action at a strategic level. So rather than delivering compensation wind farm by wind farm as is done at the moment, we can deliver a much more impactful solution by doing that strategically. I suppose some of the challenges that still has is strategic should really be as much of the marine environment as we can possibly bring in. It'd be great to see even stronger joining up between England and Scotland on this. And at the moment it only has one measure, which is for benthic protection, benthic recovery and compensation. And there are many other measures which are mature enough to go into that Marine Recovery Fund. So it's going to have a huge positive impact on the environment. It will also enable the acceleration of the move to the government's Clean Power 2030 target.
Thank you. Mike?
Marine Recovery Fund, I think, is an excellent idea. It's something we've talked about for a long time because the site-by-site environmental or benthic compensation added hugely to the delay in construction. And delay doesn't do my industry any good at all. Certainty is useful, and it's quite onerous to still be involved in a really delayed process. So strategic approach that makes possible is very, very sensible. The announcement that Minister Hardy made recently around strategic compensation, focusing on the creation of new MPAs alongside offshore wind, that's very challenging for my industry. It's hard enough to lose ground for the construction of offshore power, but then to be told that in order to compensate for the environmental damage done by that power, we risk losing more fishing ground. That's pretty hard. That's pretty difficult. That's like being told, we're taking your farm to build a power station on, and because that's going to damage the environment when we build it, we're going to take your garden as well. That's pretty harsh. It's getting evicted and then being asked to pay for the bailiffs. That's a really difficult one for us to really get to grips with. I think the offshore wind and fishing industries have done an awful lot over the years to work out how to get along quite pragmatically on a business-to-business basis. This won't help relations effectively kind of making the fishing industry pay for potential damage done by offshore wind seems quite unjust. That's little local businesses paying for damage that may be caused by large foreign-owned multinationals, and that's not a great look. That said, I'm yet to see really convincing evidence that offshore wind does that much damage to the benthos. All of the published papers that I've read suggest that the benthic damage, the seabed damage that there is from offshore wind construction is minimal. So I'm not convinced that there's an evidence-based need to protect more of the seabed because you're building wind farms. I don't think that's where the problem is, if there's a problem at all.
Thank you. Jacques?
So on the Marine Recovery Fund and then on the measure proposed, so I think first of all the Marine Recovery Fund is absolutely needed measures. We need the compensation to be taken at a more strategic level. We don't have enough like-for-like measures at the minute to sort of make up for the impacts that are potentially being caused by developments at sea. So really needed to take that strategic approach, and that's a framework that will enable us to do so. In terms of how much will it enhance the marine environment, I think we have some skepticism here because that's not the role of compensation. The role of compensation is not to go beyond recovery, it's to get back to sort of no net loss. So there is a need to develop a framework within that to sort of encourage that enhancement beyond that, and that can be whether developing a marine net gain framework that Benj mentioned just before, and that would be fantastic. Having the Marine Recovery Fund already set up might enable us to accelerate that process, which would be very welcome. But also having sort of a framework in place to sort of welcome a voluntary contribution in the meantime, like there is in Scotland with the Scottish Marine Environment Enhancement Fund, which can sort of allow to capture those voluntary contributions to enhance the marine environment and redistribute them towards projects. I mean, Ørsted has done some great work, for example, in the Wilder Humber. Having a framework in place that enables these projects to take place alongside the British coastline would be fantastic. In its current form, it's not the role of the Marine Recovery Fund, in our view, is to get to that no net loss. So there is a need to develop those frameworks beyond. Just on the benthic MPA and the measure being proposed, I mean, from our point of view, it's potentially a good measure. There needs to be ways to compensate and appreciate that. active restoration of the marine environment in some things are extremely limited, particularly offshore, and so the ways to restore the marine environment most often is to remove pressure and allow nature to take care of itself. Again, in terms of how much that will we see it impacting other sectors, I think it's important again to come back to that prioritization sector and to that multi-use element, and only focusing on the practices that are the most damaging for those targeted features.
Okay. Last one then. To Benj, what barriers does Ørsted face within the consenting process for offshore wind farms, and have changes to consenting processes led to any change in Ørsted's investment plans to 2030?
So just to answer your last question first, no, we are doggedly pressing ahead. We are currently building the world's biggest offshore wind farm for the, I think, 7th time, and that will be completed in a small number of years, and then we're moving on to another one of broadly similar scale. So no, we're pressing ahead. I think there are a number of areas where we can see the planning process can be improved, and this is not something that Ørsted alone is looking at. And as I mentioned before, I'm working closely with DEFRA and actually MHCLG and DESNES again, trying to pull all of these different parts of the infrastructure together to move on the planning process. So part of it is around the habitats regulations, which we can work with. We think there's ways to bring in better guidance, particularly around things like de minimis, where very, very small impacts that are in any scientific sense de minimis still have to be properly dealt with and compensated, and that can create a lot of delay. We see other jurisdictions where de minimis is allowed to step in and say, okay, your impact is so small, move on. That's not a place to invest time and effort in improving the environment. So de minimis is one. I think the other thing is the government's arm's length bodies, Natural England, MMO and others, are really under an immense amount of pressure. Offshore wind has grown at a pace that no one anticipated. Those agencies have not. And I think that's putting them under tremendous pressure. That slows the whole process down, of course, because they have to do their job and we have to let them do their job. But we think with the right guidance and the right resourcing and the right approach, and it was, by the way, very welcome to hear the DEFRA Secretary of State a few weeks ago saying how the government's priority around growth would be signalled strongly into all of those agencies. We think that all of that coming together will make the planning process run more smoothly and efficiently without having any detrimental impact on the environment. In fact, it should have a better impact on the environment. I suppose the last thing I'd want to say is there's a lot of focus at the moment on how do we get more wind farms through the consenting process and into the sea. We shouldn't lose sight of the challenges of building wind farms that have now achieved those consents, because once you have your consent, in England it's the development consent order, there is still a lot of work to do to get marine licenses and other aspects of the consent discharged by those agencies. And when that can take, there's an intent to deliver those licenses in 13 weeks, it can take 9 or 12 months, and that can really get very expensive for a project when, if I look at our current project, when we've got all the vessels out there, that's over £1 million a day. So we really do need to make that part of the process very efficient as well. And that is entirely doable, I believe.
Thanks, gents.
Very much. Alison Taylor.
Thank you. Can I ask Mr. Cohen if I could just go back to one of your earlier answers? You were mentioning that some difficult decisions would have to be made by government in terms of sector allocations and uses, and that there would be winners and losers. Are you willing to give a view on who you think the winners and losers should be, in your opinion?
Well, obviously, it's literally my job to say that we should win. But look, it's actually why people belong to my organisation. But obviously, look, my job is I'm in the fortunate position of my job is to advocate for the people who want me to do that for our industry. But look, I'm not naive, and I am a realist. I will always be advocating for food production, coastal communities that depend on those areas of the sea being allowed to continue doing what they've done for a long time. I recognise that the national interest may have other priorities. All I can realistically ask for, all I can reasonably ask for, is the opportunity to have those priorities heard and acknowledged. and for decision makers to be honest about the outcomes. If you close an area to fishing, you are probably costing somebody their livelihood. You are telling some people you can't work anymore, and you probably don't have something else you can do instead. You may be telling a community that the main source of employment there, that's gone now because we need that for someone else or for some other value or for some other industry. And I would like decision makers to be honest about that and to tell those people, I am doing this to you. I know I'm doing it, and this is what I'm going to do to try and help. Because as it is, we end up just trying to pretend that everybody can have everything, and therefore we don't need to help anybody because everyone's fine. And that simply isn't true. And we've been doing that for 15 years now. And it's a little bit morally dishonest to keep on doing it. So what I want, really, I want, never mind the outcome I want, that's kind of obvious what I'm going to say. I want the opportunity to have my say, and I want an honest answer from the decision makers, or an honest admission from the decision makers that they'll own the decision they've made.
Thank you for that. Well, I was going to ask about what role innovation will have in the future in managing fisheries sustainably, and are there any new technologies that you think might help contribute to the future sustainability of fisheries?
Technology is a tricky one in some ways. We've had a number of projects looking at new gear technologies and new vessel technologies. The difficulty is always in prototyping those and testing those and then getting them to the stage where they're licensed. Because fundamentally, we fish with the gear that we're licensed to use. Your fishing license tells you what you're going to use, and you can't use something else until it's approved. And what projects have tended to do is get through a sort of a first year of prototyping, funding dries up, regulators don't approve it, or just lose interest in the project, and then it sort of dies. So we need a bit more. Some really good work being done by a group called Fishing Innovation and Sustainability, looking to kind of fund stuff to completion. But there's some really good things. There's a device called the Sunwing, which is basically a bottom trawl, a beam trawl that uses hydrodynamics to kind of float across the top of the seabed. Float is the wrong word. Skim across the seabed rather than digging in. So there are some good things. Where innovation, I think, has been really helpful has actually been a kind of regulatory innovation. Now, under the last government and continued under this government, we have the Fisheries Management Plan agenda. So we're looking to manage fisheries really differently to how they were managed before under the European CFP. Fishery by fishery, area by area, bringing together industry and scientists and managers and looking to manage really kind of level-headedly and scientifically, stock by stock, and engaging everybody and taking them forward and letting experts use their expertise. And I think that's really, really valuable. It's slightly crazy that that's an innovation, but it's very different to how things were managed before. Something that we're really keen that government protects when we come to revisit the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It keeps that regulatory autonomy that we've had, that has let us innovate and change things. Because that's genuinely been really useful, and if any one thing improves fisheries management, it will be that flexibility that we've got.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Thank you, Jane.
Julia Buckley.
Thank you. Yeah, we were briefed about some of those, the remote electronic monitoring, the on-vessel monitoring systems, and they sound, quite a modern way forward using the apps and trying to tap into GPS. Yeah. And that perhaps some of those are more affordable than previous alternatives. So it sounds like quite a positive way forward. But how easy is it for fishers to access information about those new approaches or those technologies that might help them?
So the new tracking devices, so vessel VMS systems, are now mandatory across the whole fleet. Very, very useful tool in understanding how fisheries work. So they're good for us. They're not just an enforcement tool. They're not really an enforcement tool. They're a data collection tool, and they're very useful. Remote electronic monitoring done properly can be exactly the same. A really good tool for fisheries management. It's not there to catch people out, it's there to manage fisheries better. So they're a useful tool. Getting information, that needs to come from lots and lots of different sources. I have a role in that. My organisation has to do its part in making sure members are well informed. We have to take some responsibility. The Marine Management Organisation is in contact with everybody with a fishing licence, same as the local IFCAs. So getting that information out through all of those methods is really, really important. And giving people the chance to join in.
You're saying those intermediary organisations have sort of taken on that role. I'm just wondering about your demographic. In other areas where we're moving to a digital age, there are some sort of older, more traditional workers who may not find it so easy to access. Have you noticed any issues there?
Yeah, we have. Some people have struggled, particularly with the electronic catch app, the electronic logbook. So an app that you record what you've caught in and estimate weights. It's been very problematic for some people. I think the MMO was quite responsive and did try and work with us to iron out the initial problems. They were not dogmatic, they did not leap straight to an enforcement approach, they worked with people, which is really positive. We want the result, not to catch somebody out for not doing it right. It has been challenging, and we've tried to help people where we can in our membership, but no, it is difficult. We do have a lot of older people in the fishing industry. At the same time, we have a lot of people... The Catch app was an attempt to use the technology that everyone's got. Pretty much everyone uses their phone all the time. So there are going to be teething problems, there are going to be transitional problems. But I think so long as government agencies take a sensible approach to encouragement and support rather than immediately enforcement, they're problems that can be solved.
Any specific recommendations you have in that area? Now would be a really good time to mention.
Yeah, no, just that. What I've just said, really. Don't leap to enforcement. Don't put hard deadlines in for things coming into play and assuming that people not complying are doing it for bad reasons and not just because it's difficult to do. By and large, that's the approach that's been taken, and I'd like that to be kind of endorsed and carry on.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. John Whitby.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Mr Villemot, if that's okay. My question is about engaging local communities in marine governance. First of all, what would be the benefits of that engagement, and how effectively are local communities engaged currently?
So on your first point around benefits, I think more than a benefit, it's almost it's a requirement. I think it's really critical to have those channels to enable that community to have a voice within the decision-making process that's going to affect them locally. I mean, we see that, just to use an example that's part of our rewilding network, so a network of projects delivering rewilding on the ground. We have a wonderful project on the Isle of Arran in Scotland, where it was a community-led project. A group of local decided that the marine environment was decimated locally by a number of reasons. Then they decided to create a no-take zone for the local fishing fleet to benefit from it, because the damages done to their local environment was such that the local fishing industry, which was mostly potting, weren't catching anything anymore. So they've created that no-take zone. It was a community-led initiative. It was accepted by everyone locally, including the fishing industry, and that has led to the first and only to this day Scottish no-take zone within the country. Now, the Scottish government then followed suit and sort of gave it legislative power. He embedded it within a much wider marine protected area now, which sort of allowed it to be really sort of the core engine behind a wider marine restoration strategy alongside that. And it's delivering a huge amount of benefits for the local population, including in terms of tourism, in terms of and in terms of fishing as well. When you compare that to the highly protected marine area process that took place in Scotland on site, which was very top-down, which was very much, it felt like local population were being imposed on, then that has led to complete rejection of the whole program, even though that's something that could potentially have had benefits for the local public, would have had, in fact, benefits for the local population. The fact that it was done in such a way meant that it sort of led to complete rejection. So I think the first point is that it's an absolute requirement rather than the benefit. Now, in terms of the benefits as well, beyond sort of protection, you also have active restoration, and enabling local communities to take part in those restoration projects is really critical in terms of labours and in terms of having hands on the ground, being able to do it. We see it times and times again, if you give them a chance to get involved, they're so keen to go out there, get their hands dirty, go and scrub oysters, plant seagrass, collect the seeds, all these sort of things. So you get that sort of labour, you get those volunteering force behind you to strengthen your project. But beyond that, it gives them a massive sense of ownership of the project. It gives them a sort of you have a duty to care. You have sort of a duty to understand, a bit more interest in understanding the challenges that your local marine environment is facing. It provides invaluable support to government as well, because it will help government achieve its targets towards GES, good environmental status. It will help government achieve its targets toward net zero. It will help government sort of face the impacts of climate change by providing barriers to its impacts, such as like flood erosion, these sort of things. And we can see that when we have projects again in the network, Rewilding, for example, in Scotland again, which is a community-driven project. they managed to get so much people behind them to help them with the seagrass planting, with the oyster project. They released 350,000 oysters now that are self-reproducing. So you maximize those benefits, and because they've created sort of that this guide of best practice, they show that it was possible. Now communities all around the country are wanting to follow suit, and they are sort of leading a network of community-led projects. So by giving them a chance to do that, you sort of creates a ripple effect. Now, sorry, I'll keep it short on the second part, how effectively we're currently doing so. Not great. To tell you the truth, in many ways, I think there is definitely some limitation. That's how it's currently done. Some communities, like I've mentioned, Coast Rewilding, but like in England as well, the Sussex Carp Recovery Project, have managed to sort of force themselves into there. And when that happened, it's wonderful because it creates sort of great examples of how it's possible. But they are having to face so many legislative barriers, so many barriers in general, like funding barriers and others, that it unfortunately remains exceptions more often than the rule.
Going on to those barriers, what is preventing coastal communities from actively participating?
Well, so I mentioned the legislative barriers. So one of the key one at the minute is the licensing, and Benj, you've mentioned that for offshore wind projects. But it's imagine if a player like Ørsted is struggling to obtain these licenses, how can you expect community groups to get those licenses as well, to have those to kickstart those restoration projects? So it's really key to have a streamlined process. The licensing system is there for a reason. It's important to regulate what activity is taking place in the marine environment, crucial even. But for marine restoration project, particularly for non-commercial marine restoration project, there needs to be a streamlined approach that's taken that's easier to navigate for community group. And that doesn't cost well, because at the minute, I've wrote it down somewhere, but I think like every sort of advice you ask to the marine management organization, for example, to navigate this process will being billed to you for £120 an hour, which when you're having issues with the funding the restoration itself in your community group, those costs can rack up so much, and as well, it's needing to sort of take into consideration the amount of community of benefit that those communities will get from those projects, and so it's also trying to find ways to enable large-scale restoration projects to take place, not just on small patches for one habitat, but to try and take to support those ecosystem-wide restoration projects. We talk about seascape scale. Mentioned the Wild Humber project that Ørsted has led earlier, but there's also the Solent seascape projects. But these projects are sort of spearheaded by huge organizations that have a lot of expertise in navigating the complex bureaucracy behind it. For every habitat that you're looking to restore, you need different licenses, different time frame, different costs. So there needs to be a way to streamline that to be able to have seascape scale restoration projects that will deliver massive benefits for coastal communities and sort of make them want to get more involved. It's also more that can be done sort of at council level and sort of more to support great initiatives like coastal network for coastal partnerships. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I was going to say what more could be done to facilitate community-led marine restoration, but I think you've just answered pretty much, haven't you? Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's right. Giving a chance for people to do it, people will want to do it. Yeah. So remove the barriers, and you will have an army of volunteers willing to get their hands dirty and to go out and do marine restoration.
Wonderful, thank you. Chair.
Thank you very much. Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is also to you, Mr. Villemot. Legislation across UK jurisdictions currently provides protections for individual species and habitats rather than entire ecosystems. And I know you touched on this in your opening remarks. Does this necessarily provide the best protection for marine habitats, this approach?
No, I mean, it's a great question. I've talked about marine restoration here and how at the minute you only focus on, we can only focus on one habitat at a time. But it's the same around marine protection. I think there is a need to move away from that feature-based approach that isn't delivering for marine recovery. I mean, every target that we're seeing for marine recovery, for marine restoration, isn't being met. The fact that 11 out of 15 of the indicators measuring the good health of our seas, we're currently failing to meet them. She shows that there's something going wrong with the current approach. And I think for us, the crux of it is the fact that we are focusing too much on specific individual species, individual habitats, instead of looking at ecosystem-wide. The marine environment is so deeply interconnected. Every habitat species is connected by the big blue subsidized water column, you know. So if you focus on one habitat or one species, you're never going to be able to address, to drive the recovery, because you're not looking at natural processes, which is really at the heart of nature recovery and at the heart of how our ecosystem functions. So no, I think there is an absolute need to look at protection from a whole site approach. We know that, you know, there has been measures in place, for example, to start, you know, again, to come back to bottom trawling, but very, very briefly here, on even when there has been measures in place in protected areas currently to address some of the most impactful practices. In the 13 sites that were part of the stage 2, some of them, like the south of Celtic Deep, for example, you know, the measures only cover a tiny area of that, and so that leaves to wonder what protection is there for the remaining of the protected area. And can you really drive the recovery of the ecosystem if you don't take into consideration the interactions that takes place in the marine environment?
Thank you. Mr. Sykes and Mr. Cohen, I'm interested to know, if we were to move to a whole site approach, what impact do you think that would have on your respective industries? Starting with Mr. Cohen.
We would like to see a scientific approach to whatever you do. I don't think it does us any favours to say, you know, to look at whole sites on the grounds that this is just too complicated, so let's just ban lots of stuff. It'll probably work out. It's not an appropriate way to manage things, in my view. I would like us to be... look, I'm a lapsed scientist, so I'm obviously going to want the evidence rather than the gut feelings, but it is how I work, and I think it's the right way to do it. Study a site, understand what it is you're trying to protect and why, what has happened to it, and then what actions will improve it, if it needs improving. There's no value in putting in place management measures for a site if you have no idea what they're going to do. We talk about, you know, if we talk about restoring things to how they were before, to what prior state? Restoring implies we're going back to something that used to be. Well, when? Before humans used the sea, 6,000 to 7,000 years ago? Before climate change really started to affect things? What, you know, how far do we take it? Do you want to restore the southern North Sea? You'll need to remove all the pollock that have moved in there in the last 20 years. And we'll have to get rid of all the tuna that have come to Cornwall the last few years too. We don't really want to restore. I think we want healthy seas. And that requires a really empirical look at the current state of actual health. One of the most depressing meetings I think I was ever in was a meeting with some officials about the first 3 highly protected marine areas, in which there was a discussion about whether there was enough money to do a baseline study to find out what actually lived in the sites after they'd been designated. So we've designated them, we've banned everything, now we'll see what's there. And that's just utterly illogical to me. You know, as somebody who used to do marine surveys for a living, survey a site first, do a baseline, understand what's there, then design some measures that will address the problem you have found. Enact the measures and monitor it to see if they're working. And if they're not working, then do something else. Because if we want it to get better, we ought to want to know if what we've done isn't working.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Very, very helpful. And the same question to you, Mr. Sykes, about your industry.
Yeah, so Ørsted, and I think the industry more widely, would be strongly supportive of moving, as Jacques has said, from individual species and individual habitats to a more ecosystem level approach. Whether that's the same as a whole system approach is in the language a little bit, I think. And to Mike's point, we need to be data-led with this. But what we see in Ørsted, and Jacques has mentioned our Wilder Humber project, there we're doing seagrass, we're doing oysters, so in the marine environment we're doing dune restoration, we're doing the whole kind of dune and intertidal zone, because that's the way in which you can get the most impact from an environmental perspective, is not just narrowly looking at one thing. I think what it also raises is the question of where do you do this? And both my colleagues have mentioned highly protected marine areas. We think as an industry that we should be more enlightened in terms of how we approach restoring the health, particularly the North Sea. The Irish Sea is not in a great state, but the North Sea is in a worse state, I would say, environmentally. We think taking a whole biogeographical approach and then looking at where can we deliver the most environmental improvement at the lowest cost to consumers, because all of this cost from our sector will ultimately end up on people's electricity bills, and we want to keep that to a minimum without undermining the restoration of nature.
Thank you. And to each of you, starting with you, Mr. Villemot, how can marine protections be expanded without damaging coastal communities and livelihoods? So, big question, I'm afraid.
No, it's a very good one. I mean, I don't think it's fair to say that marine protection damages coastal community and livelihood to begin with. I think they're there to do the absolute opposite. In fact, I think they're here to drive the recovery of our seas and to deliver multiple benefits to the coastal communities. I mean, they depend on the marine environment. We all depend on a healthy nature, on a healthy seas. Again, when we're talking about whole site approach, we're not talking about full protection systematically. We're calling for full protection for only 10% of our seas. For the remaining areas, there is absolutely consideration for multi-users. And again, we can absolutely envisage marine protected areas that has a level of fisheries, a level of small-scale local fisheries that take place. That's something that we're absolutely willing to see in the future. So no, I don't think that in general it will impact negatively coastal communities. I think again there needs to be a case-by-case consideration here. You're talking again about. Sorry, I always come back to bottom trawling because at the minute it's such a big topic and it's a crucial one, I think. But we're talking about 33,000 hours of bottom trawling taking place in 2023 within marine protected areas. 6% of these only were from UK fishers. So these are things that will not negatively impact our coastal communities. It will deliver a huge range of benefits, including for the fishing industry, including for our net zero targets. By sort of creating healthy environment that capture carbon, that helps safeguard against the impacts of climate change. So. And sorry to finalize, we're not necessarily asking for expanding the marine protection either. In talking about making the networks that we have work, sure, identify there's still some gaps there. So maybe some species, we haven't conducted a sufficiency review, for example, for seabird protection. So there may be some tweaks needed in the network. We know that with the compensation, there's going to be some tweaks, but we're talking about replacing sites here. So not creating new areas, it's replacing the ones that will be damaged because of the impacts of development. So we're not asking for expanding, we're asking for better management, I think, which will deliver benefits.
Come to Mr. Cohen last, so you can have a final word on the impact on fishing communities. So the same question, Mr. Sykes, to you.
So I would somewhat echo what Jacques said. I think this is an opportunity. The opportunity is there for coastal communities to engage meaningfully and at an early stage in environmental improvement programs so that they can properly embrace the benefits and be part of that solution. And I'm sure Mike will talk about the potential negative consequences if that isn't done right. But I think what we've seen in the Humber and also in other areas where we're active is that by bringing communities into the room and bringing them along the journey with us, the work that we're doing has been really well received. So I don't see that necessarily as being a conflict. Clearly, we need to find ways to work together with, particularly inshore fishing. And in fact, funnily enough, Mike and I worked together on a project, the westmost rough wind farm off the Holderness coast, where I was representing the wind farm, Mike was representing the fishing community through the Holderness Fishing Industries Group. And we worked, it wasn't easy, but we found ways to work together to collaborate, to deliver a way of coexisting, which meant that everything was able to carry on. And I think one thing we haven't touched on but is really important is this point around coexistence, and that there are smart ways to work together to use the sea space to its maximum potential whilst restoring the environment. And I know others have said we're never going to be able to meet everyone's needs to the full extent, but I think that's the path to find the best solution, is not by zoning, but by working together to find the right ways of co-use for the right types of MPA.
Yeah. So, Mr. Cohen, how can marine protections be expanded without damaging your communities?
By following the evidence, again, I suppose. On that, I have to push back a little bit on that 33,000 hours of trawlers in the North Sea. With only 6% of them UK boats. I know where the figure comes from, and it recorded every single hour at which a fishing boat was at sea as if it were fishing. Given that those MPAs that they're talking about cover almost all of the southern North Sea, That counts every Dutch, German, French, Spanish boat going home as though it were fishing in British waters. Now, I'll be the first person to grumble about how much time European boats spend fishing in British waters, but they certainly do not do 94% of the fishing, and a moment's thought should tell us that that's wrong. So that figure is not correct, and doesn't reflect what's actually being done in those areas. Those boats pass through. The areas in question as well, protected for seabirds and porpoises. Even if they were trawling, a porpoise that's anywhere, or a seabird that's anywhere near a bottom trawler is in a lot of trouble already before the boat gets near it. So that's the difficulty. We have lots of assumptions and lots of things thrown out quite quickly that create a picture of what's actually happening in MPAs that isn't quite right. There's a really big difference between the sea and the seaside. People are used to going to the beach and looking at what they can see, and at sea level, the horizon's 2.5 miles away. Our EEZ goes 200 miles or until it meets another country. And a lot of stuff happens that people are not very well aware of, and that it's really easy to throw ideas about that people have no way of kind of ground truthing and thinking about. If we follow the evidence about what will actually have a positive impact on the nation, not just on a particular patch of seabed or a particular area, then we can make sure that whatever management measure we take, whether it's for particular conservation values or for energy production or gravel extraction, whatever it may be, it won't impact communities. But we have to, I kind of emphasise, we talk a lot about stakeholders in consultations. If you place a bet, the stake is the thing you lose if you get the bet wrong. Well, fishing communities have a stake in this like no one else, because if the decision doesn't go their way, they lose everything. They lose their jobs, they lose their ability to support themselves, local towns lose people paying their council tax and shopping in local shops. If I like the sea, as I do, love it, and I'm deeply engaged in it, and a decision doesn't go my way, but I don't make my living from it, I may be disappointed in that outcome, but I won't lose my house. So if we're going to make decisions about anything, not conservation or placing wind farms or anything else, and it isn't going to hurt communities that depend on fishing, traditional coastal communities, we have to weigh up the evidence and take decisions in the broader national interest. The Fisheries Act says decisions about the sea should be made taking account of the needs of the environment, the economy, society and food production, and it doesn't pick a favourite. All four of those need to form part of the decision. Going back to my theme before, make them consciously part of your decisions, MPs. Make them honestly, put your hands up to what you're doing, and then work out what you're going to do about it. It won't harm communities, even if it stops them doing what they do, if you put something in place that stops that harm, that mitigates.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. And finally, just want to touch now upon diversity. Mr. Sykes, starting with you, both as a company and sort of as a representative of the industry, what steps do you see your sector taking to increase the diversity of people working in your sectors at all levels?
So I know we're about to come to International Women's Day on the 8th of March, so maybe I'll start with gender diversity. We are, I would say, work in progress. The energy sector as a whole has not been very good, particularly in the field roles, in terms of bringing gender diversity, or indeed any diversity actually. We are working hard. We work as an industry with programs like Powerful Women, which brings energy players together to promote and support women in engineering, STEM subjects to come into our sector. And that is bearing some fruit. My own direct experience is 68% of my department are women. Perhaps that's because most of them work on environmental matters. But we are seeing as a company, it's hard going, but we are making progress. I think as a sector, there is still much more we need to do, particularly in that field workforce. It's still heavily male dominated. So we are working, as I say, across industry. We're looking at all the different ways we can progress that. We're working more and more now into Key Stage 2 as well. I'm working with the Engineering UK organisation, which is particularly focused on encouraging diversity into the STEM curriculum, particularly at Key Stage 2, because that's when decisions are made. And I think that isn't going to deliver results into our business for 10, 15 years, but it's the right place to start to bring them in. So, yeah, more to do on that front. On wider diversity in terms of disability and ethnicity, we are making, again, conscious efforts there. The way we recruit, for example, the way we develop people is very open and cited on the need to bring that diversity into our workforce, but then not only bring it in, but hold it in and develop it and bring it up through the ranks of the organisation.
You'd say you're more diverse than you were 5 years ago. There's clear progress.
Yes, there is, but we've still got an awful long way to go.
And to the same question to you, Mr. Cohen. To what extent do you think your sector is being successful in terms of increasing diversity, working across all levels?
We have far more women in the fishing industry than we used to have, for a start. Fishing is a little bit complex because fishermen are all self-employed. So at the smaller level, it tends to be owner-operator businesses. Large boats have a number of crew. Women in the industry tend to be in management roles in larger companies or running fish producers associations. I think I may get this wrong, so apologies, about 40% of my board of directors are women now. That would not have been the case even 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago. So there is an improvement in that sense. There are not many women fishing on the deck of boats, though there are some and they're very successful. But it's a little bit difficult for us to directly impact diversity of the catching sector because it's a self-employed sector. Training in the fishing industry is something that we really need to look at in terms of recruitment and retention into the industry because of the way that training's done. There isn't, you can't do an apprenticeship apart from one place in fishing. So we'd love to work more around education, and that's when we can start to look at recruitment a little bit more broadly, I think. But the improvement's being made, but we're still we're a very much an ageing workforce, and kind of quite traditionally structured, but improvement's being made.
Yeah. Mr. Villemot, how do you ensure that underrepresented voices are included in the design of marine conservation and restoration initiatives?
Very good question, and unfortunately, I think one where we also, as the environment sector as a whole, has a lot more work to do. I think, the environment sector as a whole is predominantly a white middle class sector, and I think we're trying to change that. Organizationally, we sort of trying to do a lot of work to bring more voices to nature, bring a diverse range of people to nature, but it's something that to sort of try and create vocations, but it's definitely an area in its inception, unfortunately, and I think there's a lot more work to do. I think there's some changes to be done on systemic level. The marine biology degree is the least diverse one currently in the UK, so there is a lot of work to be done at that level as well, and at the social level, I think, to be done. What we're trying to do ourselves is, I've mentioned sort of bringing more diverse people to nature. So we're having some initiatives to try and supporting initiatives to try and they're trying to do that. And we are, as well, it comes back again to giving voices to coastal communities and to the communities that are affected by those challenges. And so, it's trying to develop a network of projects alongside the UK coastline to make sure that we give them a voice. But it's a very early. We have a lot of work to do, I think, is the truth of it. We are trying it. We are on a journey, and we are trying to improve it. But we unfortunately quite early on in it.
Okay, well, thank you, all three of you, for the evidence you provided. It's been tremendously helpful, and we're very grateful for your attendance here today. And with that, the sitting is suspended. Order. Order. Well, welcome back to the second panel today within the Governing the Marine Environment Inquiry. I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Russell, by Andrew Bell and Mark Simmonds. Can I start by asking you to introduce yourselves, starting with you, Mr. Russell?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Russell. I'm Executive Director of the Mineral Products Association, which is the representative body of the aggregates, cement and concrete sector. I'm particularly responsible for planning and mineral resources, and part of my portfolio is responsibility for the British Marine Aggregate Producers Association, which is the representative trade body for the marine aggregate sector. And I've fulfilled that role for the last 23 years or so.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew Bell.
I'm Andrew Bell, or Andy Bell. I'm the Chief Exec of the North Devon UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. That covers all the land that drains to the North Devon coast and then goes 12 miles beyond Lundy, so it's roughly 50 marine terrestrial. And I'm also on the National Committee for the UNESCO Man and the Biosphere Programme, and also through that position advise and work internationally with other UNESCO sites around the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simmonds.
Good afternoon, and thanks for the invitation to be here. My name is Mark Simmonds. I'm the Director of Policy and External Affairs for the British Ports Association. We're the trade association representing ports all across the UK. I'm also the chair of the Maritime UK Policy Group.
And starting with you then, Mr. Simmonds, how does the port industries contribute to the UK's economic growth?
Well, the ports industry is the foundation of the entire marine economy, we like to say, on a regular basis. Directly, the industry employs 125,000 people across the UK, often, and we're spread out, of course, so often in areas of high deprivation, and we pay above the national average. So we're good skilled jobs spread right around the UK. We also obviously handle all of the shipping that comes into the UK. So 95% of all the UK trading goods arrives and leaves by sea. That's around 450 million tonnes a year at the moment, including more than half of our food and a good chunk of our energy as well. So we are enabling the sector for everything from energy to fishing to logistics.
Thank you. And Mr. Russell, how do the marine aggregate industries contribute to the UK's economic growth?
So the marine aggregate sector is part of the wider mineral products sector, and that sector represents the largest material flow in the national economy. Over 1 million tonnes of raw materials and products flowing through the economy every single day. Our largest customer is the construction sector, which is responsible for around £180 billion worth of spend per annum. So in that respect, the whole of the mineral products sector, including marine aggregates, provide the foundation for growth, whether that's delivering housing, schools, hospitals, or essential transport and energy infrastructure. As far as the marine sector specifically is concerned, 25% of all of the sand and gravel that's used in England and Wales comes from marine sources. And trying to break it down a little bit more regionally, London and the South East is responsible for around a third of all of the construction activity that takes place in the UK. So something in excess of £60 billion per annum. Of that, 1/3 of all the construction aggregates that are provided in the London and South East region come from marine sources. And within the M25, it's more than 50% of construction aggregates come from marine sources. So regionally and nationally, it makes a significant contribution to the economy. It's an enabling sector, similar to what Mark was describing for ports.
Yeah. Thank you. And Mr. Bell, I mean, we've heard in the previous panel about the trade-offs, if you like, between marine protection and economic growth. Give us your sense as to the sort of environmental contribution that ports and aggregates play, and dangers if it's not managed properly?
Certainly, North Devon is not blessed with massive ports. We do have a couple of small ports that we work with quite carefully there in terms of their operation, and we try to, again, extend their reach in terms of the capacity that they can take through, because it's getting lorries off the road, for example, is one of the key things about it. So we can certainly have a very good environmental benefit as well in terms of that transport coming through. So we do work with them in terms of their environmental management, trying to minimise any harm where possible. And even, say, for example, with the Port of Bristol, offering habitat compensation measures and that sort of thing to work with them to reduce their net impact on the environment has been something we've been exploring as well. And obviously, Port of Bristol did do the Sturt Island managed realignment as part of their offsetting side.
Thank you very much. Mr. Russell, how do your industries engage with communities and contribute to local economies?
It's a good question. So as a sector, we deliver raw materials to over 50 wharves around the country in 32 port areas. So from the northeast down the east coast, London south coast, Bristol Channel and the northwest. Each of those wharves will employ staff directly, but the wharves themselves will also support a wider supply chain in terms of drivers of lorries and the wider sort of construction supply chain, so ready mixed concrete plants, precast concrete plants, etc. Picking up one of the points that Andy just made previously, one of the big advantages of the sector is the ability to deliver large volumes of bulk material close to where it's needed. So effectively reducing road miles. A 5,000 ton ship, 5,000 ton capacity ship will deliver the equivalent of 250 lorries worth of raw material close to where it's required. And if you consider the Thames River, for example, as a sector, we're delivering the equivalent of 1,000 lorry loads of construction aggregates into that market every single day of the year.
Thank you. Mr. Simmonds, how do the port industries engage with communities and contribute to their local economies?
Well, ports are rather unusual and probably a bit different from a lot of the other businesses and industries that have given evidence so far, in that we are fixed, we're not mobile, we are very much rooted in the communities where they are, and have often been there for many generations. In fact, one of the oldest businesses in the UK, the Port of Aberdeen, been there since for over 1,000 years. And many of them, much of the employment in ports does tend to be very local. I was talking to Portsmouth International Port this week. 95% of their workforce lives within 5 miles of the port. And whilst not everyone will be that extreme, it's very common that most of the people working in the ports industry will be very local to the port. And of course, I mentioned the sort of the indirect economic impact through the other industries that we support, whether it's fishing or cruise tourism, or indeed logistics and warehousing and those sorts of things. In terms of how they engage, our membership's hugely diverse, so I have to give a bit of a caveat in that a lot of my answers will be most ports do this or some ports do that, but it's very common for ports, and we actually have a programme which we can share in writing with the committee, where we've highlighted a lot of the programmes and initiatives that ports do in their communities, whether it's boosting skills or investing in local charities and things like that. So we have a good bank of evidence of some of the good things that ports do, but it of course varies from place to place.
Very much. Sammy Wilson.
Okay, thank you. In your evidence, you indicated the various regulatory hoops you've got to go through when obtaining planning permissions and marine licences, etc. What impact does all of the environmental marine protection requirements have on your industries? Maybe Mr. Russell first, and then Mr. Simmonds.
Thank you. I think a fundamental constraint, similar to what Mark was saying previously for our sector, is that it's only able to operate where commercially viable geological resources are present. So it means that our the area in which we're able to undertake our activity is geographically constrained. As a sector, we've been going for well over 50 years, so we're well accustomed to managing the requirements of marine protected areas, and it certainly does come with some challenges. I think the biggest challenge at the moment, which was picked up on in the previous evidence session, to be fair, is the changing pressures as a consequence of other activities that are emerging, and particularly renewable energy, because they're kind of changing the landscape that the whole of the marine development sector is operating across. And what it's effectively doing is reducing the environmental headroom that's available for all the other activities that are taking place, which produces significant challenges, I think, for those activities to adapt, because they are going to need to adapt going forwards. And being able to adapt within the current framework of environmental protection is potentially going to be quite challenging. I think similar to what Mike Cohen said in the previous session, and indeed Benj, Sykes to a degree, what we need is more flexibility, recognizing that the evidence and the data gaps may not necessarily give us all of the answers to make the informed decisions, but being able to make some decisions as opposed to just defaulting to a precautionary approach where the position is effectively you can't do what you were doing previously, has clearly got to be a better outcome than just saying stop, particularly given the various unintended and consequential impacts that would have, both in terms of employment, jobs, but also in terms of the wider economic needs of the country.
Thanks. I'd say it's not necessarily the regulation itself, but the way it's implemented and delivered. One of the questions in the previous session was about the balance, and I think a lot of our members would feel that the current system isn't quite working for nature, and it's not working for industry either. So in a way there is a balance, but not the one you'd want. We find that consenting processes obviously adds cost. Nobody thinks you shouldn't have those sorts of processes, or that the system needs to be thrown out or anything. But our members tell us that consenting bodies and their advisors are often extremely risk averse, which I have some sympathy with, because they are under a lot of scrutiny and will be challenged for the decisions that they make. But they are also under-resourced, which tends to increase the level of risk aversion, because if you're up against a tight timeline, it's much easier to ask for reams of more and more data and put in an objection rather than agree to something. So our members raise that with us on a very regular basis, and that, again, we support broadly the idea of the precautionary principle, but we find that the way it's implemented is it's not used as a way of managing risk, it's used as a way to justify having no risk at all, which doesn't work for many of our developments. We also find the overall processes are extremely prescriptive and very process driven. So I agree, as I almost always do, with what Mark said previously about the need for more flexibility and a more dynamic approach. We're talking about marine ecosystems that are very dynamic, and we think the way they are managed and protected and enhanced increasingly also needs a dynamic approach as well, and we don't have that at the moment. So it adds cost and it adds a lot of time.
One of the comments in the information that was supplied to us, and I mean, I didn't actually see any comments made about there being too much regulation or anything like that. It was more, I think, to get the quote, was the slow speed of the process was causing a huge constraint on economic growth. How do you see the process being speeded up to deal with the kind of issues which were raised in the comments that you made in your brief to us?
So there's two ways. You can throw out what we've got at the moment and start again, or you can make tweaks and reforms to what we have and try and speed it up. I think most marine developers lean towards the latter and keeping a lot of the knowledge and experience that is accumulated with the current system, but improving certain pinch points. So our members quite often tell us that scoping and screening and then the scoping phases can be extremely difficult, and there could be more common sense applied by regulators in those stages. We think that one of our other criticisms, or something that's often raised with us, is the amount of data that is regularly asked for in the process of securing a marine licence. And we think those could be better challenged, but those go back to the point earlier. There's two twin problems. One is the resources of those of the regulators and the advice bodies, that they need more resource, but that is not the answer on its own. There needs to be some changes to the process as well, and we've got some specific ideas about how that can happen.
Mr. Russell, do you want to come back in that question?
Yeah, just to kind of add to what Mark said. He's absolutely right. The regulatory regime often becomes the focus of why the system isn't working, and actually the problem isn't so much about the regime. It's about how the regime is being applied in practice. And a major issue, which has been an issue for a while but is accelerating, I think, is the capacity and the competence within regulators and advisors, which kind of moves the test of acceptability around risk and precaution. Because if you're in your first job, the last thing you actually want to do is drop the ball on behalf of the organisation that you represent. The Chancellor had a roundtable meeting in January, I think, with various government regulators, talking about trying to improve the way that they supported economic growth. And I think that's a really important step to take, because while we have the growth duty in place, which is supposed to require regulators to enable outcomes, I think in practice it hasn't necessarily delivered what was anticipated or expected. The Chancellor challenged the chief executives of the major regulators to change the culture within organisations, and I think that's quite an important step to try to take. Currently, I think if you ask most of my members their views on the advice they receive from advisors, it tends to be no, because. And actually what we need to try and turn it around is yes, if. So have a system that enables sustainable outcomes, as opposed to just continually puts in place barriers, and finding a way to work more collaboratively to actually navigate a way through the rather sort of congested and tricky regulatory waters that all marine developers have to try to navigate through. Thank you.
I mean, both of you have mentioned risk and the risks involved in the working in the marine environment. But what risks do you see arising when marine planning is developed but without meaningful stakeholder engagement? And that includes, yourselves, but also the communities that are affected by it, and also the environmental perspective. I mean, Mr. Relmy, you want to start that one?
Yeah, thank you. Just an absolute opportunity to say something, because we've helped with the regional plan for the marine plan for the Southwest, and work very closely with the MMO and participating in the consultation alike. And one thing that the regional plan doesn't do, it's not very good at putting lines on the map and actually sort of getting that fine granularity. So what we've done in North Devon is tried to actually sort of get into that deeper phase and actually trying to look at where would we put aquaculture, where does the wind industry going to come in within port corridors, where can it sort of do X, Y, Z, with the idea to actually sort of literally de-risking the investment for those particular industries and how they would actually work in the area. So we can actually then get the social licensing sorted out. So in other words, the acceptability of those kind of developments and what they would mean into an area. So it just eases that path through so that, again, developers don't come in and do abortive consultations or investigations. We can actually sort of try and steer them into the right places where it'll work and be most acceptable. So that's very much a way that we're trying to work within the planning system and to help that through.
I suppose the risk is, you don't have the community engagement, or you have ambivalence from developers. That's sometimes what we find when trying to engage our members on marine plans. I do recognise that we are still relatively early in terms of putting a marine planning system in place. I know it's been 13 years or whatever, but it's still going from nothing to something takes a long time. It's tricky. It's also tricky for us because ports already are lines on a map, so we already have a spatial element as far as we're concerned. We're there, and we've also been doing marine spatial prioritisation within harbour areas for forever. If you look out the window, you can see marine aggregates going up and down the Thames, pleasure boats and taxis and all sorts of things. So it's something we've been doing for a very long time. So it can be a bit frustrating for our members watching the sort of pace of development of marine plans. We're also finding it difficult to engage the government are beginning the process of updating marine plans, starting with the East Plan right now, and we haven't yet seen the government's hand on what they want in terms of spatial prioritisation. So we found that some of the previous rounds were trying to guess what government policy was going to be on things like net gain. Now we've got that, and now they're trying to update it and guess what government policy is going to be on marine spatial prioritisation, which seems odd when they're both parts of the same government. So I understand that they need to update these things, but we kind of would like to see more from government engaging on the spatial element of what these plans are going to include.
And Mr. Russell?
Thank you. I think it's important to remember that development of planning systems takes time, and with my other hat on, I'm also responsible for dealing with terrestrial planning as it applies to land-based minerals. And we need to remember that the land-based planning system evolved from the end of the Second World War. So it's been kind of evolving for the thick end of 80 years. And we're currently going through a process of fundamental planning reform, as you will all know. So it does take time to establish planning in a meaningful way. And the other important point around that is planning means different things to different people. And I think in that respect, there needs to be perhaps be a little more clarity around what marine plans do versus what they're not able to do at the moment, which I think is recognised by the MMO. I mean, fundamentally, for planning to work effectively, it needs to work holistically, and that was certainly the intention of the Marine and Coastal Access Act that was introduced in 2009, which was supposed to move us away from the sectoral approach towards planning for activities and regulating activities and kind of bring them all together. I'm not sure whether it's done that necessarily, because you've effectively got a two-tier development system where you've got those activities that are covered by marine licensing, where decisions have to be made in accordance with the plan. So the plan effectively guides decision making. And then you've got NSIP projects, which covers renewables and a range of other big infrastructure activities, where decisions have to be made with regard to, which means that actually they're not driven by the policies and the structures that are in place within the marine plans, which makes it quite difficult for those activities that kind of are governed by the marine plans to plan themselves and manage themselves. That holistic piece is really important, because it means that the planning system can try to reflect on the intended and unintended consequences of decisions, which I think a number of the discussions in the previous session were picking up with. At the minute, there seems to be a kind of a focus on the policy prize, which in this case is renewable energy, without necessarily thinking through what the knock-on implications could be to all the other activities that are taking place, whether intended or unintended. And that's a real gap and weakness at the moment, I think, of the way the system works. One of the ways that potentially that could be clarified is by revisiting the UK Marine Policy Statement. So that was introduced in 2011, again, as a consequence of the Marine and Coastal Access Act. And I would argue that some of the prioritisation within that has changed. And while that never really set out differing weights behind the activities that were there, it was more saying this is important for this reason, this activity is important for this reason. We are reaching a point now where there does need to be more clarity around prioritisation, but as part of that, also more transparency around the knock-on implications and consequences that may arise from that, and how those are going to be managed, because at the minute that feels like quite a big gap, to be honest. Thank you.
Thank you. Just moving on, both of your industries are regarded as having a big environmental impact, and very often it's interpreted as having a detrimental environmental impact. What measures do you take to try and reduce and incorporate within your activities measures to ensure that your environmental impact is minimised?
I would challenge that we have a big environmental impact in ports, actually. So there's a number of activities that have some sort of impact on the environment. Probably the biggest and most obvious is maintenance dredging, which is most ports will have a statutory duty under their legislation to maintain the depth of channels and berths so ships can continue to safely navigate into them, and that is usually done by dredging. So most ports have powers to dredge and will need a marine licence to dispose of the dredged material, and then there's the other set of activities will be capital dredging, and so that's expansion or deepening of harbours, which is more of a traditional development activity. Both types of dredging are very tightly regulated and managed. Maintenance dredging, we would say actually that can actually have a positive impact on the environment, especially ports are very often in estuaries or sensitive environmental areas, just because of the history of where they've developed. And in estuaries you'll get sediments and water coming down from the river, and sediments and water being washed in from the sea. And quite often you will have contaminants from other industries, whether it be farming or whatnot. In some cases we have contamination from Roman mines still being washed down some rivers in the UK and being deposited in the mouths of estuaries and then dredged by ports. So in some cases ports are actually removing contamination from a river or seabed. There's a lot of monitoring and sampling that's required in most dredge campaigns. And in the disposal of those things, but quite often you might, if you do have contaminated material, which can only be dredged up to a certain level of contamination, you are then concentrating that in those disposal areas and removing it from estuaries, which are more sensitive environments. So that activity is very heavily regulated, and we would say that. Where you don't have contaminated sediments, the impact is relatively low. So the amount of dredging varies massively. So some ports might do 2 or 3 campaigns a year. Others, Dover or Teesport, will be dredging almost every day of the week, depending on how regularly they silt up. And in those cases, the more often you're dredging, the more likely or the less likely you are to be having any detrimental impact. Because the material is moving in so quickly, there's not likely to be anything living in there, and it's been done for decades in many cases. So the impact is fairly low.
The more often the dredging happens, probably the better for the environment.
Yes. So the impact on the environment is extremely site specific. It varies from place to place. Disposal at sea, which is by far the most common method of removing dredgings, is again relatively low impact and contained in a small number of disposal sites. Of regulated disposal sites around the UK. And in terms of wider marine development, so capital dredging or building of new quays and things like that, again, that's regulated in the usual way. And ports, when they obtain a marine licence, will very often have conditions placed on them. So one of the things for both maintenance and capital dredging, a common condition is that you can only dredge certain times of the year to avoid impacting migrating birds or fish or whatever it might be. Sometimes that can go a little too far. We've had ports, one port I know that ended up having a 3-week window a year where they were allowed to dredge because they had so many different conditions placed on them until they did object, and that was loosened a little bit. And that's probably another good example of where the regulators keep piling on conditions and without really looking at the impact that has on the port's ability to operate. Conditions commonly placed on sort of the day-to-day operations, and then often on the sort of licences for capital projects as well.
Mr. Russell?
Thank you. I think similar to Mark, there are perceptions around impact which perhaps don't necessarily reflect reality. The total UK continental shelf area is about 867,000 square kilometres. The total area of seabed that's licensed for marine aggregate extraction is 1,000 kilometres, and the area of seabed that's actually dredged is around 100 kilometres. So you're looking at a relatively small, a very small footprint of impact, potentially significantly less than 1% of the total area. Fundamentally, the marine licensing regime that exists is predicated on environmental protection. So any activity that is licensed has to be environmentally acceptable in the eyes and the view of the regulator and the statutory advisors that advise them. And I think that's a really important point to note. And the EIA process that kind of underpins the licensing regime looks to identify the potential impacts, consider their significance, and then look at ways to manage, mitigate, and also monitor them. And it's the management, mitigation, and monitoring, I think, which is where the significant developments have taken place within my sector. We've adopted a regional approach towards both environmental impact assessment and towards regional monitoring, which means rather than every single developer doing individual studies, we do collective studies. And it also means that this has allowed us to adopt a more consistent approach towards management and monitoring, with regional monitoring taking place, which is rare. And I think as a sector, we kind of broke the norm in terms of adopting that approach, because we just felt it was a much better way of delivering sustainable outcomes, and it was a much more effective way of delivering more consistent assessments in conjunction with the regulators and their advisors, because they could just have one conversation instead of potentially having 9 or 10 different parallel conversations. I think the other important point around the management side of things is guidance. The previous government very much stepped back from guidance, and I think that has been to the detriment of the way that the marine environment is managed, because guidance is as much about defining guardrails and boundaries for regulators and advisors as it is for developers. And that's kind of been forgotten in a sense, and it's compounded by the fact that the regulators and advisors are under so much pressure at the moment. Guidance would really help. From a marine aggregate point of view, when our guidance was withdrawn, we produced our own guidance, industry best practice or good practice guidance, which we developed in partnership and consultation with our regulators and our advisors. And the .gov website actually signals towards that, signposts towards that guidance now, which I guess reflects the fact that it is recognised. But in my view, it kind of it represents a poor substitute for having definite guidance that's produced by government, which, as I say, defines boundaries and guardrails for how things work.
Mr. Bell, from your side of looking at it from your side of the whole issue, as far as the regulations are concerned, do you believe that the regulations are sufficient? And as far as the practices that your organisation would have observed, do you believe that those regulations are sufficiently implemented by the likes of ports or aggregates industry to deal with any environmental harm which may occur?
As a rule, yes, I would say that they are. There's always sediments are critical to the marine environment and how it behaves, or if it's going to be toxic or whatever. So it's important that they are moved and regulated properly, and I don't see any issues arising from the ports and their current operation with the regulations as they are. I can understand how they feel about sometimes it's how those regulations are applied, and the process being sort of too long or too restrictive in some ways. I think there's room for wiggle there, but there's other things like the beneficial use of sediments as well. Where we've done mandatory alignment, recreating salt marshes and the like. You can take some of those sediments that are being dredged, provided they're clean, that actually help with restoring salt marshes and keeping those healthy, because they've got to keep pace with sea level rise as well. So the additional use of those other sediments would be quite handy for that. The other thing I would say is the monitoring data that the industries are doing is something that there's a dearth of within the marine environment, and the more that is shared and open, then more people can actually use that and benefit from that. So we've got various things that we're trying to deploy in the Bristol Channel area, like sound sensors, so we can actually detect marine mammals, but also some of the sensors that are being deployed, they can actually sort of listen to sediment movement as well. And so there's a lot of sort of good science that's out there, and if it's augmented by what the industry is doing, particularly as Mark Russell says, gathered on a regional basis, that would be really sort of good to have that sort of compounded with other data sources to get a much better picture of how the marine environment really works. And that means you can start addressing some of those questions about the dynamism within the marine environment and how that behaves. So we can then start looking at more flexible approaches that's more suited to those particular sites.
Great, thank you. We asked the other panel this question. Do you see how new technology can help to improve the outcomes from the activities of your industry?
I can start. Yes, absolutely. I think sometimes people look at our industry as a mature industry as not one that's particularly innovative, but we've seen quite a few new things either coming in and starting to be used in the way we operate and undertake development. So some examples are new ways of doing your hydrography. So anything from having autonomous vessels surveying harbour areas to near-Earth observation. Satellites can, doing it almost in real time and being able to tell you give you detailed bathymetry of certain places is quite impressive, and it's not far away in terms of being able to be deployed fairly consistently. There's other things about new dredging techniques. I was talking to Harwich Haven, who are the harbour authority for Felixstowe, who do a lot of dredging, about new ways of dredging there, which is essentially just agitating they'll probably tell me I've explained this wrong, but agitating the seabed and then allowing the tide to move some of the sediment out naturally as well, in a way of sort of maintaining depth there and new ways of doing things there. So yeah, there is lots of innovative ways of doing things, and on the capital side of things, we're seeing more use of things like bubble curtains to reduce noise from piling and other impacts underneath the sea. So yeah, we are starting to see things both from the operational side and in terms of capital development as well. And just to sort of touch on that as well, on the beneficial reuse, which is sort of taking some of that dredge material and then using it for beach replenishment or flood defence or other good things. We're sort of working closely with government on trying to remove some of the barriers to that as well. So dredging is expensive. You usually have a lot of material to get rid of very quickly in a specific area. So it can be difficult to match up dredging with the need for those sorts of things. And there are licensing and legislative barriers as well, which we're working with government, but it's hard. But so there's changes in innovation going on in both the sort of the practice and the legislative side too. And I probably had have a go at the MMO a bit already today, and probably will again if I get the chance. But I should say they've actually shown repeatedly that they can be innovative in the way that they licensing processes. They're undertaking some transformation at the moment. They've introduced self-service licensing for low-risk activities. They've innovated by having longer-term licenses for various activities and exempting low-risk things too. So they have shown that they, at that level, can take steps in innovating and doing things better in that way too.
Thank you. I think we need to move on. Thank you. Cameron Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. If you're content, then I'll forgo the first two parts of this question. I think they've been answered. Gentlemen, how are nature recovery timelines factored into planning for port operations or marine aggregate activities?
Go first. So nature recovery, one of the things I wanted to say earlier as well, in sort of general comments, is that there is a bit of a disconnect between the protection of nature and the restoration and enhancement of nature. And one of our criticisms of the current system and the way net gain and other things are being approached is that they are being approached completely differently. So you protect and then you do your gain separately, whereas there should be one integrated system. So we are still talking to government about marine net gain and how that's going to work in the marine environment. We have it in the terrestrial side, and that does go down. That covers the intertidal area as well, which, as far as we're concerned, is essentially more like a marine environment anyway, that intertidal zone. So in a way, we do have some. We have mandatory net gain conditions there, and that will be factored into any new development from last year, which is not going particularly well, unfortunately. More broadly than that, it would be through the licensing process or the marine planning process that these sorts of considerations are taken into account, and harbour authorities are required to have regard for marine plans in the decisions and actions that they take.
Thank you. Mr. Russell.
Thank you. It's an interesting question. The issue of nature recovery at its heart, I think from my sector's perspective, is grounded in an understanding of impacts and recovery. Marine aggregate extraction is, unlike many other forms of development, is a temporary use. So we're not resulting in permanent long-term change necessarily by putting something in place or removing something. The impacts associated with marine aggregate extraction are more akin to temporary disturbance, and what the evidence that we've gathered and other regulators' advisors have gathered over the last 30 years has shown is that so long as the seabed sediments remain the same or similar at the end of extraction, so if you start with sand and gravel, you finish with sand and gravel on the seabed, then recovery does happen naturally. The timeframes change. It can range from 6 months for full recovery to potentially 10 years in some cases for stable environments, but the recovery does happen. The licensing regime effectively ensures that happens by having requirements to leave capping layers and ensure that the seabed sediments remain the same. And that's enforced through license conditions and monitoring of license conditions. But the evidence piece is really, really important. And we're talking about biodiversity net gain at the moment, and the potential, and also the Marine Recovery Fund, where significant sums of money are invested to try to deliver better outcomes. This isn't new. The aggregate sector as a whole has had something called the aggregates levy applied to it since 2009. The current rate per tonne is over £2. I think it's £2.07 off the top of my head, but it's of that order. And that generates about £400 million worth of income to Treasury annually, of which marine contributes probably £20 million of that rather. The reason I raise it is that the levy, which I think is unique in kind of the taxation world, was introduced with the objective to better reflect the environmental consequences of winning primary minerals, whether it was on land or offshore. And for a period of time, a portion of that income was used to help inform applied research projects to fill data gaps and actually enable better outcomes. But that stopped in 2013, and effectively all the aggregates levy is now is a revenue raising mechanism. It doesn't differentiate between good practice and bad practice, and it doesn't actually do anything to directly contribute to better environmental outcomes. So there's perhaps some lessons there that need to be reflected on for both the Marine Recovery Fund, but also the BNG process that's running forward at the moment, given some of the practical challenges that Mark referred to that are emerging from its early application. Thank you.
Mr. Russell, do you have any points as from your position?
Yes,
that you'd add to that?
Thank you. Certainly, the marine part of the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, we produced a marine natural capital plan, which looked at what's all the habitats and benefits, etc., that comes from that, and the flows and how they can be improved. And there's a kind of response to that as well, saying, well, what about the individual species? So we had to produce a marine nature recovery plan. So we have those two documents sitting in place, and with wide consultation with the fishing sector, with other users in the area, how it's been used with Bideford and Appledore ports, for example, and Ilfracombe. They're not major ports, I must admit, but they are in North Devon. But yeah, and so we work with those in trying to get that marine nature recovery plan in place, and it's there really. It's an open invitation now to work with developers. There's been an opportunity for marine net gain for things that are happening within the Bristol Channel / Celtic Sea. So we hope to sort of move that forward. But in addition, I'd sympathise with both Mark and Mark about BNG, and particularly how that applies in intertidal areas. We've got a lot of expertise with managed realignment and recreating salt marshes and the like. And the way that the metric works at the moment is it's only positive if you're doing recreating salt marsh on areas that are degraded arable land or developed land. Most estuaries are flanked by coastal and floodplain grazing marsh that's sitting behind flood defences. So if you want to do what the estuary needs to do in terms of maintaining the right kind of shape and its morphology, you need to actually do the managed realignment onto those freshwater grazing marshes, which is another priority habitat. You do the BNG calculation for that and it comes out negative. So you're going to have to do 3 times as much area in terms of creating new freshwater grazing marsh to compensate for 1 hectare of salt marsh that you need to create. So it is really perverse just because of that priority habitat bit. So we would advocate really for estuarine and coastal systems, we need a fresh look at that system-based approach as to how the estuary is going to respond to sea level rise over the next 100 years, and then how the ports are also adapting to that. And then how we can best maintain the best morphodynamic shape of the estuary without actually being penalised because somebody says that's another priority habitat there. We do need to recreate those freshwater grazing marshes. There's no doubt about that because that's the roosting sites of the overwintering birds and the like. But we just need a simpler system where we can finance those things, working with the developers to make it much easier in that particular context. The terrestrial ecosystems, the BNG works fine. It's as a calculator, it's a little bit complex now with the legal agreements that are needed, makes it really cost prohibitive, and that's why we're not seeing many off-site compensatory measures being done at the moment, because the developers are just buying a bit more land and doing all their BNG on site with mitigate, sort of being, that mitigation hierarchy being applied. which is good, but it means that all the hope that we had of delivering some broader and strategic ecosystem-based improvements are being lost because of that complexity. So we need to make it much easier to apply, particularly, as I say, estuaries. It needs a fresh look.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bell.
Thank you very much. Anna Geldod.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Bell, what unique cultural and heritage benefits do marine biospheres represent, with particular reference, of course, to the North Devon biosphere?
Well, yeah. So when we were setting up the Biosphere Reserve in North Devon, we were sort of doing consultations on where and what to include. And so originally, because we were looking at ecosystems as being the basis of defining it, we came up with a bathymetry that went out into the Bristol Channel and came round and back and joined the coast at Cornwall Devon border. And it was the fishermen that said, why are you doing that? Why don't you just go to the 12 nautical miles? Because that's where we fish. There's our ecosystem. So, and what we want to do is say that our fish are sustainably caught inside a biosphere reserve. So there was that instant sort of working with the fishery sector and that partnership we had. So included within that 12 nautical miles, in fact, the one that really extends it further is Lundy, which was the UK's first marine conservation site and the first no-take zone. And of course, we've got all the rest of the coast around North Devon that has all those reefs as well as the big shore, open beaches, for example. And those beaches themselves have now been declared a World Surfing Reserve, the first in the UK. So that's from the Save the Waves Federation, the California-based institution. But there's 13 such reserves around the world. And so we work hand in glove with the World Surfing Reserve in terms of the management of that surfing industry, or management of the beaches for the benefit of that surfing industry, because that surfing income is worth 52 million to the local economy every year. So there's a lot of hangs on the culture, the living culture, as well as the shipwrecks. The people sort of mentioned some of the wrecks around the coast of that, and having sort of dived on, I think you mentioned it yourself, was diving on those wrecks really does bring a lot of good things in terms of tourism, but also the wildlife benefits as well.
Yeah.
So I could wax lyrical for a long time, but obviously there are other UNESCO sites within England. We've got Brighton and Hove, and the Isle of Wight, but also the Isle of Man is a biosphere reserve, and then we've got Galloway in South Ayrshire and Dovey Valley and Wester Ross. UK system.
And so what measures are necessary to ensure the protection of these marine biospheres?
At the moment, biosphere reserves are a non-statutory designation, so they're designated by UNESCO at the request of member states. So the purpose or the process is that normally it's local communities get together and say, we think this would be a great idea for a biosphere reserve, having the functions of conservation, sustainable development and knowledge generation, and how that all fits together. And then that's approved by government and then submitted to UNESCO, where UNESCO approves it. So there's nothing in UK policy at the moment that actually says anything about biosphere reserves at all. So there's things about World Heritage Sites, which is one of the other UNESCO designations, but there's nothing about geoparks nor biosphere reserves. There used to be, but it was kind of institutional memory loss when the UK left UNESCO. So, but as the 7 sites in the UK are sort of delivering and testing policy for government, local government as well as national government, I think it's worthwhile to say that it should at least be reflected in some policy somewhere. There is a belief at the UK level that if you try to make them a statutory designation, like a national landscape or a national park, it would pickle it in aspect. And I think one of the strengths of biosphere reserves is that they are an open and dynamic tool that can try and address the problems of the day. So you use those lessons and apply those to the other parts of the country, which is why we're quite keen and quite happy to work with the ports and the energy industry and the aggregates industry and the fishing industry to say, well, what are the better ways of doing this and how can we manage MCZs in a better and easier way, rather than sticking rigidly to the rules, is how do we make that flex? How do you improve on that to get those win-win-wins?
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear. And finally, to a question for everyone, but maybe I'll come to Mr. Simmonds first. What benefits does a sustainable marine environment bring to local coastal communities, such as those in my own area in South East Cornwall?
Well, it brings in areas like South East Cornwall tourism, and it would be an obvious one. There are numerous health benefits and other social benefits to sustainable or to healthy environments and living in those areas and visiting them as well. So yeah, that's yeah, and many of our, we represent a lot of most major ports in the country, but we also we have 115 port members, and they own and operate 400 ports all around the country, and that includes a lot of very small harbours as well. So we do have an interest in that, and and having healthy seascapes and marine ecosystems brings people to those areas. It's good for ports, good for local communities too.
And Mr. Russell, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, we're slightly different, I guess, because our activity generally takes place at a considerable distance offshore. But nevertheless, I think we can and we do make a contribution towards the kind of the wider marine stewardship piece, largely as a consequence of the data and the evidence that we're able to collect, whether that relates to bathymetry and physical processes, or the geological origins of the deposits that we're dredging, or archaeological or historic environment artifacts that we recover. All of them kind of help build a better understanding of the environment in which we operate. And certainly the historic environment piece is an area that we've contributed an awful lot to in terms of understanding the prehistoric landscape that used to exist across our continental shelf during the ice ages when it was dry land.
Yeah, and finally, Mr. Bell, do you have anything to add around that question around the benefits to local coastal communities?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, coming from South East Cornwall, is the sea is the big driver for tourism, as was mentioned earlier on. In North Devon, it's probably about 0.56 billion per annum is really what that tourism economy is worth. We know consistently from all the surveys we've done with tourists is that 80% of them are driven. Everybody says it's 80%, but it's 78% to 82%, depending on which year you do it. But 80% are driven by the environmental factors that sort of brings them there. So it is the coast and the marine in particular that brings the people down. So if you said 80% of 0.56 billion is actually really what the environmental value is worth in terms of those cultural ecosystem services, just purely on tourism alone, then it's worth giving that the thought, isn't it?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Russell, Mr. Bell, Mr. Simmonds, thank you very much for your evidence today. We very much appreciate your attendance. And with that, the sitting is suspended. Order, order.